Across England, church bells fell silent. The sources agree on that much. Bishops ordered them stopped as one of the most visible signs the entire kingdom now stood under sanction. Weddings still happened, but not the way anyone expected. Couples could still be married, but out at the church door in front of witnesses rather than inside at the altar. For most of the population, public mass simply stopped happening. The burial question is genuinely more complicated than popular retellings usually admit. Some accounts describe the dead being denied consecrated ground entirely, but at least one detailed academic study of this exact interdict describes burial in consecrated ground actually continuing throughout the period, even as the fuller religious ceremony families expected around it was stripped away. Historians researching the same 6 years don't fully agree on this specific point, and this documentary isn't going to pretend the record is cleaner than it actually is. None of these people had done anything wrong. This wasn't punishment for something they'd chosen. And here's the twist almost nobody expects. The Pope hadn't actually excommunicated them, not the country and not most of the individual people living in it. What he'd done was something else, a weapon most people today have never even heard of. And it was about to drag a king, a kingdom, and eventually the King of France himself into one of the strangest political showdowns in medieval history. So what actually happened to England? Were ordinary Catholics personally cut off from their own church? Could anyone still be baptized? Could the dying still receive the sacraments? And how far was this conflict actually going to go? It started with an argument over who should become Archbishop of Canterbury. When Archbishop Hubert Walter died in July of 1205, the position sat empty, and two very different groups believed they had the right to fill it. The monks of Canterbury held their own quiet, arguably premature election. King John pushed hard for his own preferred candidate, a bishop named John de Grey, someone he trusted and could work with. Both sides sent their case to Rome. Pope Innocent III rejected both of them and appointed someone else entirely, Stephen Langton, an English-born cardinal who'd spent decades studying and teaching theology in Paris. On paper, Langton was extraordinarily well qualified. To King John, that Paris connection looked like something else entirely, since Paris meant closeness to Philip II of France, John's greatest rival. John refused to accept him, expelled the Canterbury monks who'd sided with Rome, and made it clear Langton would never be allowed to set foot in England as Archbishop. Pope Innocent III wasn't a man inclined to simply let that stand. Elected Pope at just 37, he held one of the most expansive views of papal authority of any medieval pope, someone who saw the papacy not merely as a spiritual office, but as a court capable of judging kings themselves when their actions touched on faith, morals, or the Church's own rights. He was both willing and able to use the Church's spiritual weapons for direct political leverage, and he'd already shown that willingness against other rulers before John. John had picked a fight with exactly the wrong pope to underestimate. On March 23, 1208, English bishops, acting under Innocent's direct orders, formally laid an interdict on all of England and Wales. Here's what that actually meant in concrete terms. Public mass stopped. Church weddings in their normal form stopped. But it wasn't a total blanket shutdown of every single sacrament for every single person. Confession remained available. The dying could still receive anointing and the Church's care through viaticum, and infants could still be baptized. The interdict targeted specific public communal religious life, not literally every point of contact between an individual soul and the Church. If you enjoy discovering strange, real pieces of church history like this, the kind almost nobody hears about in school, subscribe to SacredHeart. There's a lot more hiding exactly like it. So were the ordinary people of England personally excommunicated? No. And that distinction matters enormously. For the purposes of this story, excommunication functioned as a personal censure, attached to a specific person because of something he'd done. An interdict, at least as medieval canon law of that era applied it, restricted specific sacred rites within a place, affecting everyone living there regardless of their own individual guilt. Nobody in an English village had personally offended the Pope. They simply lived somewhere the Pope had decided to apply pressure. Why punish people who'd done nothing wrong? Medieval Europe didn't separate religious life from ordinary daily life the way modern society often does. Sacraments, feast days, church bells, funerals, and public worship were woven directly into the fabric of everyday existence. That's exactly what made an interdict so effective as a political weapon. It turned an elite dispute between a king and a pope into something an entire population felt directly, every single week, whether they understood the politics behind it or not. John didn't back down. If anything, the interdict seemed to make him angrier and more defiant. He retaliated hard, confiscating the property and revenues of clergy who enforced the interdict, seizing church lands and treating them as his own source of income, effectively profiting from the very punishment meant to bring him to heel. Several English bishops fled abroad rather than remain caught between an angry king and an equally determined pope, leaving entire dioceses without their leading clergymen for years at a stretch. Innocent escalated again. In 1209, he excommunicated King John personally. Still, John held firm. By the end of 1212, with years of stalemate behind him, Innocent went further than either side had yet gone. He formally declared John deposed, and historical accounts describe him authorizing Philip II of France, John's longtime rival, to enforce that sentence, effectively clearing the way for a French invasion. Historians researching the precise legal mechanics and surviving documentation of this exact episode don't agree on every detail, but the core outline, deposition declared, France's position to act on it, is well established. Picture what that actually meant. A dispute that began over who would run one cathedral had escalated into the Pope of Rome greenlighting a foreign invasion of an entire kingdom. Facing a genuinely existential threat, John finally broke. On May 15, 1213, at Dover, John met with the papal envoy Pandulf and did something almost nobody watching could have predicted. He didn't simply agree to accept Langton. He formally surrendered the entire kingdoms of England and Ireland to the Pope and received them back as a vassal, a tenant holding his own kingdom under papal overlordship, obligated to pay an annual tribute of 1,000 marks to Rome from that point forward. The charter recording the act, sealed with John's own golden seal, describes him offering his kingdoms directly to God, to Saints Peter and Paul, and to the Roman Church, framing the surrender as an act of penance for his own offenses against the Church. He was formally absolved of excommunication by Langton 2 months later. The conflict that began over an archbishop's appointment ended with the King of England formally surrendering the kingdoms of England and Ireland to a papal envoy and receiving them back as papal fiefs, holding his own crown thereafter as a vassal of the Pope himself. And even that dramatic surrender didn't end things immediately. The interdict itself, the original punishment that had silenced English church bells for years, wasn't lifted until July 2, 1214, more than a year after John's submission, once further conditions between the two sides had been fully worked out. England had spent more than 6 full years under those restrictions in total. Here's where the story takes its strangest, most ironic turn. 2 years after his surrender, in June of 1215, John's own barons forced him to seal Magna Carta at Runnymede, limiting royal power in ways that would eventually shape centuries of English constitutional history. And the same Pope Innocent III who had brought John to his knees now did something that surprises almost everyone who hears this story for the first time. He annulled it. In August of 1215, Innocent formally declared Magna Carta void, arguing it had been improperly extracted from a king who was now, technically, the Pope's own vassal, and that it prejudiced rights the papacy itself now held over England. Stephen Langton, the very archbishop this entire conflict had been fought over, was suspended shortly afterward for refusing to excommunicate the rebellious barons on the Pope's behalf. The Pope, who once nearly cost John his throne, had become the single institution most invested in keeping him on it. So could a modern Pope do anything like this today to an entire country? Not in this form. Current Catholic law still recognizes both excommunication and interdict as real penalties, but the elaborate medieval system of territorial general interdicts, the kind capable of falling on an entire kingdom regardless of individual guilt, no longer exists in the Church's current legal framework. Interdict today functions as a personal censure applied to individual offenders under specific legal conditions, rather than as a collective territorial mechanism laid across an entire population. Simply put, current canon law doesn't provide the same medieval-style general interdict Innocent used against England in 1208. So return to that opening image. Silent bells, restricted worship, a country living under religious sanction for something its king had done, not its people. The Pope never actually excommunicated a country. What he used was arguably stranger, and it worked exactly as intended, a penalty capable of making an entire kingdom feel the weight of one ruler's defiance, whether they had any part in that defiance or not. A dispute over a single archbishop's appointment grew into 6 years of interdict, a king's personal excommunication, the threat of a foreign invasion authorized by the Pope himself, a stunning royal surrender that turned England and Ireland into papal fiefs held under the Pope's own overlordship, and finally, most improbably of all, the same Pope who'd broken John turning around to defend him against his own barons and their new charter. A fight over one archbishop had somehow ended by reshaping the relationship between a pope, a king, and an entire kingdom, and it had never once required excommunicating a single ordinary person to do it.